You might be forgiven for thinking that this is some late 20th century abstract art. In fact, it's early 19th century. It is the very first photograph. This was created by Nicéphore Niepce, who was an inventor, an experimenter. Niepce coated a sheet of metal and left it exposed for several hours. The result is this hazy view where you can sort of think that there is an image, but it's just too unfocused. There's not enough detail to know. With present-day techniques, with computer enhancements, this picture has been improved sufficiently that you can actually tell exactly what it is. It's a view from the window of his house at Le Gras. You are indeed looking at a shed, and it's the windows, which are the objects, those fuzzy objects that are on both sides. Photographic technique evolved rapidly, and within 10 years, the Parisian Louis Daguerre had perfected techniques which allowed him to take photographs with an amazing clarity. Here is a view of Boulevard du Temple in Paris. It's interesting because it looks like there is no traffic, there are no people. This would have been an exposure of at least several seconds. People are moving, traffic is moving, and they won't be registered on the photograph. There's one exception. If you look down here, you can see that there is a man standing, probably having his shoes cleaned. And of course, those few seconds when he'd be stationary allowed him to be photographed. The most well-known name from these pioneering days of photography was undoubtedly Nadar. Actually, that wasn't his name. He was born with the family name Tournachon. And he had a group of friends, artistic friends in Paris, who decided he needed a nickname. So they nicknamed him not Tournachon, but Tournadar, and that got abbreviated to Nadar. That is the name that history remembers. He took photography and raised it to the level of an art. One of the things he did, for example, was to go in a balloon and take the first aerial photographs of Paris. Nadar even took his wife up in the balloon. There they are, 1,000 meters up in the sky, taking selfies, and you can see the rocky terrain far below them. Well, not quite. Nadar was the first person to explore the possibilities of trick photography, and so he didn't need to ask his wife to ascend further than half a meter off the ground. In the centre of Paris, there is a huge shopping centre called Les Halles. It's a tourist attraction and it's well worth visiting. Just to the southeast is the Fountain of the Innocents, or the Fontaine des Innocents, and there's a fascinating story linked to this little square. 5 centuries ago, this was a cemetery. At the time, it was pretty much on the edge of Paris, and it was extensively used for anyone who died in Paris or around Paris. At first, there were individual graves, but it became way too crowded, and so they turned the individual graves into mass graves. As time went on, even the mass graves became overcrowded. And by overcrowded, I mean that when they had placed, I think it was 1,500 bodies in one grave, then they would open another grave. Paris, of course, was expanding during this time, and over the next 300 years, the city enveloped the place that had been this cemetery, and it was decided that it could no longer be used as a cemetery. Therefore, all the bones were transported and put into the catacombs. By 1850, the old cemetery had been turned into a marketplace. There was a fountain which had existed on the edge of the cemetery, and it was rebuilt in the middle. You can see it here. That fountain is still there. Of course, the marketplace no longer exists. It is still a square, but its only function is to provide seats where you can sit and admire this old fountain. So what happened to the bones? Well, at first they were taken and just thrown indiscriminately into the catacombs underneath Paris. And then it was decided that they really should be organized. So in the early 19th century, the director of Paris Mines decided that he would take these bones and organize them in such a way that people could visit them. And you still can visit them today, and this is what you will see. The Paris we know today is 150 years old. Before that, it was vastly overcrowded, it was dangerous, the sunlight could not penetrate to the streets, and it was unhealthy. Cholera would break out frequently, and with rooms where there would be maybe 24 people living, the cholera spread rampantly. Because of the conditions, there was a lot of civil unrest as well. And in the 2 decades between 1830 and 1848, there were 7 armed uprisings and revolts. And because of the narrowness of the streets, it was very difficult for the army to put them down. Industrial waste was simply dumped into the small rivers that all emptied into the Seine, so that the whole city would stink. Napoleon III decided that Paris should be transformed from this dirty, overcrowded, run-down city. He therefore ordered the prefect of Paris to transform the city. The prefect's name was Georges Haussmann. He wasn't an artist, he wasn't an architect. He was a functionary. Since the emperor had ordered him to clean up Paris, Haussmann undertook what became one of the most radical reconstructions of a city. From the mid-1800s, Paris essentially became one big construction site. He tore down buildings, he tore up streets, and he built new streets with long, wide, straight lines.
And it's interesting that straight lines carry a distinct message about power. Old Paris had narrow street with lots of corners, and of course you cannot fire a cannon around the corner. And knowing about the history of revolutions in Paris, maybe Napoleon III wanted to have wide streets, straight lines, because it would be much easier for him to control the crowd. I think the military mind likes straight lines.
Haussmann also added lighting. Of course, in those days it was gas lighting. There were some 20,000 gas lights that he added. And he added urinals in the street, which apparently makes Paris the first modern city in the world. Certainly a convenient thing to have.
For men.
You remember that we said that Louis XIV had established the Royal Academy of Art in 1667. Almost 130 years later, this was replaced by the École des Beaux-Arts, or the School of Fine Arts.
There were classes for the artists, members of the academy, but also every year there were big exhibitions. At first for the members of the academy, but from the year 1795, all artists could participate in the so-called salon. Not only French artists, also artists from outside, from all over Europe and America.
Ernest Meissonier was probably the most typical representative of the academic style.
Least talented, probably, but most admired.
I believe he was one of the best-known artists, wasn't he,
at that time? He is a very typical painting by Meissonier.
So this must be Napoleon coming home from the supermarket with his bag of groceries.
From Naples. I believe he is coming back from a victorious battle. It's a very accomplished painting, but times were changing. It's outdated.
There's no original thought here. Every year, the École des Beaux-Arts organized what they called a salon.
The salon was an art exhibition, and every artist could submit their works, and they were judged.
Every inch of the wall was taken by the paintings, and these are only the paintings that were accepted.
And it's interesting because they were the judges and the members who accepted the works, and obviously they wanted their students to have the best place, so there were lots of fights between them, and those who were the strongest could display the works of their protégés, their students usually, in the best spot.
Here's a fascinating comparison for you. Here is a photograph of the paintings that have been accepted, lined up on the floor, waiting to be put up on the walls. And here, for comparison, is an image of the rejected paintings. Naturally, the painters who had been rejected were very upset about it. They wanted their works to be seen. So Napoleon III actually decided to put on a special salon which would display all these rejected paintings.
Look at the lineup. I guess people expected to see something outrageous.
Racy.
Provocative. I wish there were lineups like that today to see paintings at art galleries.
What sort of paintings were rejected then?
For example, this famous Symphony in White by James Whistler.
Which today is considered a very fine painting. At that time, it was derided for having no sense of colour, no sense of form, no sense of composition. And here is another one, probably the most famous of the rejected paintings. And this is, of course, Édouard Manet, Le Déjeuner sur l'herbe, or Lunch on the Grass.
For the contemporary people, it was scandalous because it depicted a contemporary scene at the Bois de Boulogne, which was known for meeting of men with courtesans.
So the two men in the painting are dressed in contemporary clothes.
Whereas they are dressed in historic costumes. Mm-hmm. But at that time, of course, it was contemporary.
Let's compare this then with Titian's The Pastoral Concert. The same sort of composition, isn't it?
Oh yes, but it was painted in 1509. It's a historic painting.
So the ladies are not courtesans, they are...
Maybe muses.
Is there anything else in this painting which would immediately be considered provocative to a 1860s audience?
Definitely her gaze. She is staring at the viewer, maybe inviting. Edouard Manet was a very important painter, the first who rejected the style and the subject matter preferred by the academicians. Although he was from an upper class, he decided to depict real life of Paris, people from lower classes, even prostitutes.
Manet's painting Olympia caused a scandal at the Salon of 1865.
What would be scandalous here? First of all, the subject matter, and second, the painting style.
The subject matter, because once again it is a contemporary setting. It depicts a courtesan awaiting a client.
And the painting style, totally new. Manet was using broad brush strokes, unlike the academicians. If you look at the academic painting, you can't see brush strokes at all. There were many nudes submitted for the salon, but they were all perfect women, not real women. They were Venuses and other mythological figures. The colors are unnatural as well. We have very harsh light.
The colors were compared to the horror of the morgue.
We actually know the name of the model. She modeled for many of Manet's paintings. Her name is Victorine Meron, and she herself was a very accomplished painter.
In 1876, she submitted some paintings for exhibition at the Paris Salon. Her paintings were accepted. They received positive reviews from the art critics. However, Manet had his paintings rejected. She was very happy. Just to give you an idea of what was accepted, here is the painting The Birth of Venus by Alexandre Cabanel. This represents what was expected at the Salon. Although he's not considered an impressionist, his technique is certainly impressionistic.
Here Manet depicts his younger colleague, Claude Monet. Monet is considered the first artist who painted in the so-called impressionist technique.
And there is this quote from him, "Nature is my studio." The Impressionists adopted Manet's technique. It was called an alla prima technique. Without that, they couldn't have painted fast enough to capture the shifting effects of light. So, what is this blob of red paint?
Oh, can't you see? It's a rising sun. Or, to be more precise, it's an impression of a sunrise.
So, as I'm sure everybody knows, this is Claude Monet. It's his painting called Impression, Sunrise.
Maybe not the best painting by Monet, but probably the most important because it gave the name to the entire movement called Impressionism.
Claude Monet was born in Paris, but his family moved to Le Havre when he was a child. He went back there when he was 32 and painted this picture. Every aspect of the picture is a fleeting impression of what he could see from the window of his room overlooking the port.
He used just a few broad brush strokes to show the reflections of sun on water.
When the critics saw this for the first time, they were outraged. They condemned it, saying that this is unfinished. It's just an impression. If we're talking about Paris and artists, then we're probably talking about Montmartre. The name comes from two words, Mont meaning hill and Martre meaning mare. The legend is that Saint-Denis was martyred on this hill. He was beheaded on this hill. Many of those artists were attracted by the Moulin Rouge a cabaret which opened over 130 years ago now. The shows that were put on there, and still are put on there, were provocative, to say the least. Probably one of the most provocative dances that came from there was the can-can. One of the names that topped the bill at the Moulin Rouge 100 years ago now was Mistinguett. Contemporary reports say that she could not sing in tune. She had a very nasal voice. She was incapable of dancing. Nevertheless, there was a time when she was the highest paid female entertainer in the world. What was it that she had that made her so popular? Well, she had a charisma when she was on stage. Her routines were racy, and she had an interaction with the audience which made her a great favorite.
J'aime flirter, quand on me plaît je le dis sans hésiter. Dès que j'entends un refrain des faubourgs, je m'attendris toujours.
Since the official salon wouldn't accept their paintings, the Impressionists decided to organize their own exhibition. The photographer Nadar offered them his studio.
A very fashionable address in Paris.
Nadar had his signature displayed boldly over the front of the building. And the building is still there, and it hasn't really changed. Been modernized, of course, but it's still very recognizable. Here is a painting by Camille Pissarro. This is part of Paris that we haven't been in yet. This is looking down the Avenue de l'Opéra, and there, that building at the end, is the Opéra.
And that's where Edgar Degas found his models for his painting of ballerinas.
Let's go and take a look at some of Degas' work. Edgar Degas is, of course, known principally as a painter, but he also did sculpture, the most famous of his sculptures being the Little Dancer of 14 Years.
Today, it seems like a romantic icon of the ballet. She was just a very poor girl from the lowest classes.
She was one of the so-called little rats of the opera, one of the little dancers. I think it was originally said that she has this wonderful, distant expression.
But the more you study it, the less adorable she looks. The sculpture is not impressionistic at all. Although he was an impressionist, considered to be an impressionist, it's very realistic.
It's very realistic, yes. But the Impressionists were realistic.
In a way that they painted from nature. He even used real ballet slippers and real cloth, and I believe real hair at one point, but later it was cast in bronze. There are many copies of the sculpture now at different museums. Degas never painted the ballerinas performing. He preferred to go backstage, and he was depicting them stretching, adjusting their shoes, or sometimes yawning, relaxed poses.
Not decorous poses.
Yes.
Yeah, okay, sure.
Yes, it seems that he was very much interested in reality. He depicted working girls, not the angels on the stage.
On stage and off stage.
And off stage.
Okay.
And if they were on stage, he would be depicting them not as someone who is watching the performance. He would be standing in the wings, sketching. His favorite theme was rehearsals.
He was fond of depicting the girls in undecorous poses. Or even, as you can see here, you can see the legs in the left corner.
Yeah, the ballerinas walking downstairs. You can't see the ballerinas, just legs. Of course, it was shocking for the audience.
Why was that shocking?
Because he didn't depict the ballerinas. You're supposed to have a composition if you depict a person.
It's supposed to be a composition, and it's composed only of legs.
Another rehearsal, but this time we have a man who is there to choose his prey. It was a reality for the ballet dancers at that time. They were allowed to come, they would pay a little bribe, and they were allowed to watch rehearsals and choose the girl for the night.
Wow. I'm sure you all know the musical, The Phantom of the Opera. The action of that musical takes place in the Paris Opera House. I said a moment ago that the scene with the ballerina's legs looked like a snapshot. In fact, Degas was very interested in new techniques, wasn't he?
Yes, and he used this technique in his paintings. There are lots of crops, and like the legs, sometimes there is a half of a face and so on. He was just fascinated with this new technique.
Just one other comment on this photo. Remember, in those days, it would have been a long exposure. Do you know how long the exposure was?
15 minutes.
15 minutes. Our two heroes here, who are Mallarmé and Renoir, would have been sitting without moving for 15 minutes. The exposure then would have been lit with oil lamps, because of course they didn't have electricity in those days. So there were apparently 9 oil lamps. And it's interesting that in the mirror behind, you can see Degas, who was taking this photograph. So I'm guessing that he didn't move either for 15 minutes. And they had a little audience as well.
It's a bit blurry, but maybe he moved a bit.
They didn't know they had to sit still. 1889 was an important year for Paris and for the arts. It was chosen as the date for the 4th International Exhibition, and it was called the Universal Exhibition, or Exposition Universelle. It was, of course, the centennial anniversary of the French Revolution in 1789. It was spectacular. There were almost 62,000 exhibitors. There were pavilions built for each country, and for the entrance price of 1 franc, visitors could marvel at the lifestyle and the architecture of places like Argentina, the Dominican Republic, Persia, Norway, Siam. There were 50 pavilions that you could visit for the price of 1 franc. Now, to give you an idea, 1 franc in those days would have bought you 2 pretty good meals with wine. All those pavilions were torn down after the exhibition, and the exhibits removed, with one exception. Here's a series of photographs taken at the time. Now, you may think this looks as though it's being torn down. Actually, it's just being built. I'm sure if we let it build up a little bit higher, you will recognize what we're looking at. It is, of course, the Eiffel Tower. And now, of course, it is one of the landmarks of Paris. At the time, a large group of very influential people, including a lot of artists, wrote a letter to the government condemning the tower. They said it would be a blot on the wonderful Parisian landscape. It would overshadow places like Notre Dame. Curious that now we see it as soaring gracefully into the sky, one of the most recognizable landmarks. Artists and musicians were, of course, very interested to see the pavilions. Probably none more so than Claude Debussy, who was fascinated in particular by this Java village, the village javanais. What he found in here was a revelation. It was an orchestra, but not an orchestra that he was used to. It was an orchestra that consisted of metallophones, xylophones, gongs, and drums, and it's typical of Indonesia. It's called a gamelan, and it created a sound that mesmerized him. Some 14 years later, Debussy showed the influence of what he had heard when he wrote his suite called Estampes. The first movement of this suite is called Pagoda, and it evokes the gamelan sound that Debussy heard at the exhibition. This is one of my favorite painters, Henri de Toulouse-Lautrec.
That wasn't his full name, was it?
His full name was Henri-Marie Raymond de Toulouse-Lautrec Montfat.
Obviously, he wasn't from a working class.
No, he was from the high class. He died very young from alcoholism.
And syphilis, probably.
Right. But the paintings of the life that he embraced, the life that fascinated him, are wonderful. There are 2 main areas for his painting.
He spent a lot of time at dancing halls.
So here, for example, there is Le Moulin de la Galette.
Dancing halls for the working class, but many aristocrats frequented places like that because it was very exotic for them.
And the other place he frequented was the brothel.
He even lived there permanently for some time.
You remember that we were looking at the painting Olympia a few moments ago. She was not in a brothel. She was probably at her own home because she was pretty much naked and she was sitting on her bed and she had her maid. This is what would happen in a brothel. They would be sitting in the reception room waiting for the clients.
Toulouse-Lautrec, like Degas, was very much interested in sketching real life, real poses. The girls are obviously bored.
And the pose is undecorous.
She doesn't pay attention to the artist who is sketching her.
Like Toulouse-Lautrec, Auguste Renoir frequented the Moulin de la Galette. Although they were depicting the same subject matter, they saw different things, or they saw the same thing in very different ways. Toulouse-Lautrec depicted real people doing real things.
Didn't try to embellish.
Renoir, on the other hand, idealized his public. He made them look pretty, he made them look happy, he made them look carefree.
And also, his paintings are easy to digest. They're just simple, pretty, everyone looks happy. It's a pleasure to look at them.
Renoir is also known for depicting idealized nudes.
This one looks like a typical 19th century pin-up girl.
By the way, Renoir almost became a choir boy rather than a painter. When he was very young, Charles Gounod took him into his choir and gave him singing lessons. It was only really because the Renoir family couldn't afford those lessons that Renoir did not become a choir boy. If you think you don't know the composer Charles Gounod, here's an extract from one of his pieces.
Renoir had several children and he painted them all. Here is a portrait of his eldest son, Jean.
All his children went on to great careers in cinema, none more so than his eldest son, Jean, who became a very well-known director.
His father became famous in the artistic capital of Europe at that time, in Paris.
And his son, Jean, became famous in the United States, because, of course, the United States was the home of cinema.
And also, after the Second World War, New York became the artistic capital.
As a cinematographer, Jean Renoir had some fabulous ideas, and later directors often said that he was their inspiration. Here's one very short extract from a film that he made in the 1930s. His originality here is that the lady is on a swing, but Jean Renoir wanted the cameraman to be on the swing as well, so that you get these two perspectives. One is the lady swinging and the background is stationary, and the other is where the background is swinging and the lady is stationary. But New York will be another adventure. Let's move back to Paris. Suzanne Valadon started her life in the arts as an artist's model.
When she was in her early 30s, she decided that she would like to have a career on her own as an artist. And she asked the artist she modeled for instructions, for mentorship. They brushed her aside. They ignored her. The only artist who took her seriously was Degas. He mentored her, and they became friends till he died.
And there was another artist from a much earlier generation. He was called Pierre-Cécile Puvis de Chavannes. His rendering of the female nude figure implied that he'd never actually seen one, but he felt this was probably what it would look like.
At one point, he recruited Valadon to be his model.
And the resulting image shows that he has now at least discovered what the female form does look like. Suzanne Valadon became the most sought-after model for the Montmartre artists.
For example, Degas, Renoir, Toulouse-Lautrec. She also painted her own self-portraits.
The effect of Degas' teaching is very obvious when we compare portraits. She did her self-portrait at the age of 17 or 18 years old in 1883, and it's competent. Compare that to the self-portrait that she did 15 years later when she had been instructed by Degas. Here we have very powerful line, a sense of colour and composition. So she was sought out by all the artists, went to bed with most of them, but what was she actually like? Each artist gives us a representation that is for him the true Suzanne Valadon. But was she really a drunkard, as Toulouse-Lautrec seems to make out? Was she really fabulously beautiful, as Renoir seems to make out? Well, let's look at a few photos. The charisma, the magic, comes through even in photos. Here she is. She's not looking at us. She's looking beyond us. She's looking at some further magic world. Was she pretty? Well, yes. Here's a photograph which shows her as a very pretty girl. Well-formed, with a lovely face, and still that distant, absent expression. She never married, but she did have one son. His name was Maurice Valadon, but when he grew up, he was known as Maurice Utrillo. There is a very funny story about the naming of her son, because it's said that no one knew who the father was, least of all Suzanne Valadon. And so when her son was born, she went to see Renoir, for whom she'd posed 9 months earlier. Renoir looked at the baby and said, "No, he can't be mine. The colour is terrible." So she went to see Degas, for whom she had also posed. Degas looked at the baby and said, "No, he can't be mine. The form is appalling." So she was very upset, and she went to a cafe, and there she found an artist she knew called Miguel Utrillo. She explained to him what had happened. Miguel Utrillo said to her, "Well, call the baby Maurice Utrillo, because I would be glad to put my name to the work of either Renoir or Degas." He is one of very few artists who was actually born and raised in Montmartre, and I believe he spent his whole life there, didn't he?
Yes, he did, and he painted almost every inch of Montmartre. He was a master of cityscape.
I guess we should say Montmartrescape.
His paintings have an aura of loneliness.
And actually his mothers do as well, don't they? Suzanne Valadon's paintings also have an aura of loneliness.
Yes, they were not happy people.
In 1894, Suzanne Valadon went to a cabaret in Montmartre called the Black Cat, or Le Chat Noir. There she saw the cabaret pianist playing. His name was Eric Satie. He was in fact a composer as well as a pianist, and his fame rests very largely on one piece he wrote in 1888 called Gymnopédie. It seems it was love at first sight, and although she had come with a friend, she and Satie went off home together. The next morning, Satie proposed to her. She said no, she wouldn't marry him, but she did move into a room just next to his in Montmartre. There for 6 months, they saw each other. He wrote music, and she did this portrait of him. About 6 months later, she left. He was broken-hearted, and although he lived for more than 30 years after this, he never had another relationship. What art movement came after Impressionism? In all logic, it was called Post-Impressionism. In fact, there was no one school of Post-Impressionism. It was more a collection of artists who were dissatisfied with what Impressionism was doing. Georges Seurat was one of these post-impressionist artists. He had read some scientific treatises on light and the decomposition of light into colour, and he was fascinated to try it out for himself. He developed a painting technique called chromoluminarism. Unluckily for us, it is known under a different name, which is easier to say, pointillism. In pointillism, colours are not combined on the palette, but they are applied in very small dots to the canvas, and the eye of the viewer will combine those dots to create the colour that the artist wants. Let's take a look at Seurat's most famous work, called A Sunday Afternoon on the Island of La Grande Jatte. Seen this close up, the painting seems to become fuzzy, almost as if it were out of focus. The problem here is that we are standing just too close for the eye to be able to combine the dots of colour into a single homogeneous colour. But at the same time, we are not close enough to see those individual dots. Let's go even closer. At this resolution, we can see that the individual dots are green and brown and pink and blue, and the eye cannot put those colours together to form a single hue. It's a fascinating technique, but one which is almost inevitably going to fall by the wayside. There is an almost inevitable rigidity in the composition, and the time it takes to put these millions of dots together tends to stifle creativity. Interestingly, this is exactly the technique that a computer uses to render an image.
Van Gogh obviously looked closely at paintings by Seurat. Instead of meticulously applied dots, he used strokes.
He probably didn't have the patience that Seurat had to put those millions of dots.
Yes, very different temperament. But the effect was the same.
The strokes would blend in the viewer's eye.
So you have to look at those paintings from a distance to appreciate them.
Like so many painters in Paris at the time, Van Gogh was not French. He was not Parisian. He came from Holland.
And he lived with his brother, Theodore, in Montmartre.
You can actually still see the front door. If you go to Rue Le Pic, you will find there is a plaque announcing that Van Gogh lived there.
And here is a view over Paris from the window of his apartment in Montmartre.
The buildings on either side frame a view over Paris. That big building in the distance in the middle, I guess that must be...
It looks like Notre Dame.
Yes. Today, Montmartre is a part of Paris. However, in Van Gogh's day, one side of the hill was the city of Paris, and the other side of the hill was the fields. In the last century and a half, Paris has expanded to encompass Montmartre. Like Maurice Utrillo, Van Gogh would set up his easel in the streets of Montmartre and paint the everyday scenes. The terrace of a café with the garçon standing in front of it. The Moulin de la Galette. And a street scene of a moulin à poivre or a pepper mill. We've heard the word salon many times. What is a salon? The salons in Paris, they were really centered on women. It was the cultural acts of their life. The salon would be directed by the hostess. She would invite people who she considered to be good conversationalists, for example. She would direct the topics of conversation so that the whole focus of the salon was through the hostess.
She has to be also someone highly intelligent.
Yeah, they generally were, I
knew
think.
about literature, painting, music, politics.
And in a sense, that says it all, because women in politics was a real no-no in those days. So if women had ideas in politics, which of course they did, they had to create their salon in order to be able to express themselves politically.
The salon was really an informal university for women. The most famous salon at the end of the 19th century in Paris was the salon of Misia Godebska-Sert.
Her circle of friends included many famous artists. Here we can see 3 portraits of her by Bonnard, Renoir and Lautrec. And of course there's a photograph there of Toulouse-Lautrec with Misia Godebska.
She was called the Queen of Paris.
La Reine de Paris. Madame Sert was at the centre of the cultural scene of Paris for pretty much 40 years, from the late 1890s right through to the 1930s. Her circle of friends included anybody who was anybody.
Not just in Paris, in Europe.
Her circle included Marcel Proust, considered to be one of the most influential authors of the early 20th century. Maurice Ravel. His name is often cited in the same breath as Claude Debussy. Ravel is most famous for having written the piece called Bolero. Auguste Renoir, who saw the beauty in the female form. Stéphane Mallarmé, who was one of the most original of the French poets. If you don't know Mallarmé's work, go and read Un coup de dé n'abolira jamais le hasard. Paul Verlaine, one of the symbolist poets. And 2 who need no introduction. At the top left, we have just been talking about Henri. At the bottom left, somebody we'll meet in a few minutes.
And by the way, Misia Godebska-Sert was Polish.
A cathedral of hands. So far we've talked about painters, but there were also sculptors in Paris, and the most famous was Rodin.
It shows 2 intertwined right hands belonging to 2 different people. Originally it was carved in stone. Now there are many casts of this famous sculpture.
The original title of this was The Ark of the Covenant. This is a sculpture that surely needs no introduction for anyone. It is, of course, The Thinker by Rodin, and it sits in front of the Rodin Museum in Paris. The story of it, though, is fascinating. It was originally commissioned as the top part of a doorway called the Gates of Hell, a doorway to the museum which was never built.
So the thinker, in fact, was not a thinker. It depicted a poet, Dante Alighieri, the author of the Divine Comedy.
The commission fell through, but Rodin went on working on these sculptures for the rest of his life, for the next 37 years.
Some of the figures were exhibited individually, but the most famous of them all is certainly this one.
The poet is sitting, looking down into hell and meditating on his work.
Originally, it was a smallish figure, maybe about 70 centimeters.
But later, several very large casts were made. I think the largest was 180 centimeters.
Seated figure, so if he would stand up, he would be a giant. The idea for the kiss dates back to 1880.
Like the thinker, the kiss was intended to be cast in bronze for the Gates of Hell, but the project fell through, so Rodin decided that he would rethink it as a marble statue. It's based on a 13th century story where Paolo and Francesca are sitting reading a book of courtly love poems, and Francesca happens to be married to Paolo's brother. So the brother comes in and finds them sitting there reading poetry, which apparently you have to do with your arms around each other, and he stabbed them both to death. So of course they go to hell.
And this sculpture depicts their first kiss.
There was a lot of speculation at the time as to whether the kiss actually represented Rodin with his lover, Camille Claudel.
A very talented artist and Rodin's student.
It's arguable that her talent as a sculptress exceeded that of Rodin.
Here is Claudel's answer to the kiss.
This is a sculpture she did in 1905 called Shakuntala. They had a tempestuous affair, in spite of the fact that he was 24 years older than her, and they often did complementary sculptures, as for example here, where Camille Claudel has done a bust of Rodin, and Auguste Rodin has done a bust of Camille Claudel. It ended tragically because Rodin decided that he would actually go back to his wife, and Camille Claudel descended into a mental breakdown that lasted for the rest of her life. 20 of her works are now housed together with Rodin's works in the Musée Rodin at Paris, but she has also been honoured with her own museum in Nogent-sur-Seine, which is quite close to Paris. Art can take many possible forms, and in the Paris of the turn of the 20th century, it took all forms possible. Coco Chanel brought fashion to Paris. Her childhood was anything but rich and glamorous. She was orphaned, she was raised by nuns who taught her to sew, and that skill set her on the path to stardom. She opened her first shop in Paris in 1910 and started out by selling hats. Her path to fame began one day when she was cold and she wanted something warm to wear, so she took an old sweater and fashioned it into a dress for herself. Many of her clients asked her where she bought the dress, and she offered to make one for them. In the 1920s, she expanded her business to include perfume. One day her perfumer presented her with a range of new fragrances and asked her to choose the one that she would like. In order to distinguish them, he numbered them, and she went through them and said, well, the fifth one is the best, we'll use that. And so was born the Chanel No. 5. She is quoted as saying, "Perfume is the unseen, unforgettable, ultimate accessory of fashion that heralds your arrival and prolongs your departure." She had a short-lived relationship with the composer Igor Stravinsky, and there is even a movie about their relationship called Coco Chanel and Igor Stravinsky. We're going to finish by looking at three artists who were not Parisian, they were not French, but they each gravitated to Paris and they made their name and their fame there. Let's go back to Montmartre. Here we are at the turn of the 20th century, when Montmartre was just a dingy, rundown area. We're looking at a dirty, rundown tenant house. You'd never expect anything good to come out of this. But hang on, there's a young man just come out of the door. That young man is Pablo Picasso. Picasso lived here.
And Cubism was born here.
Indeed, in those early years of the 20th century, Picasso evolved a new style, very different than what had been seen before, which became called Cubism. Here is his painting of Violin and Grapes.
His invention, he called later Cubism, was to show one object from different angles on two-dimensional surface. His most famous painting from that time is La Demoiselle d'Avignon,
or The Ladies of Avignon. Contrary to what most people think, Avignon is a street in Barcelona where the brothels were. He died in Paris. He worked in Paris. He lived in Paris. But he was born in Catalonia. Salvador Dali must be one of the most recognizable of all painters. Today, his museum, the Dali Paris Museum, can be found in the heart of Montmartre.
Surrealism is a movement which defied logic. It's the art of dreams.
Some would say that it is the logic which defies art. Art critics have projected the idea that the persistence of memory was inspired by Albert Einstein, Sigmund Freud, and even possibly mental illness.
Dali confirmed that he was inspired by a camembert cheese melting in the sun.
Paris, no word sounds sweeter to me, wrote Marc Chagall in his autobiography.
He lived almost all his adult life in Paris and painted Paris from his window.
Shortly after arriving in Paris, he painted the view of Paris, and over half a century later, he was still painting Paris through his window. In 1960, the French were outraged when the government commissioned Chagall,
who wasn't even French,
to paint the ceiling of the national monument, which was the Opera. Many felt that the historic stately architecture of the opera house would be blemished by this modernist painting.
But when it was finished, it became a benchmark for integrating modernism into France's historic landmarks.
The painting commemorated historic and contemporary artists, composers, actors, dancers.
The canvas measured 2,600 square feet.
And it took some 200 kilos of paint. Today, it stands as a focal point for visitors. I can't leave Paris without paying homage to at least one of its great singers. Edith Piaf is the incarnation of Parisian music. Edith Piaf had a very good voice, ideally suited to the kinds of songs that she started singing. Many of those songs have become eternal favourites of the French public, and none more so than La Vie en Rose. This was a very brief overview of the cultural history of Paris.
Many artistic movements were born there.
There was Gothic,
Rococo,
photography,
Impressionism,
Pointillism,
Fauvism, Cubism,
and Surrealism.
Just because we are finishing with Chagall does not mean that nothing artistic happened in Paris in the last 50 years.
It simply means that we have run out of time.
And also the art scene moved to New York
after the Second World War. So if you stay with us, Artamica will take you to New York next.